My name is Louis Chevrolet. I'm the man whose name is now printed on the back of millions of cars, rolling down highways and city streets across the world. But I wasn't always a symbol of American speed and strength. I began life among the quiet ticking of watch gears in a tiny Swiss town. Some say I had the speed of a bullet and the soul of a mechanic. Others just remember the name printed on their father's first car. Tonight, I will tell you the story of my life. But before we begin, let me ask you something. If you were born into poverty, in a town known more for clockmakers than car engines, and you had nothing but your hands and a dream, do you think you could change the world the way I tried to? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you could send a message to me in the past, what would you write? Leave a comment below. Now listen to this interesting story about my life journey. It's Christmas Day, 1878. Snow settles like powdered sugar across the rooftops of La Chaux-de-Fonds, a town nestled high in the Jura Mountains of Switzerland. This place is famous for one thing: watches. The streets hum with the precision of tiny gears being shaped, tweaked, and assembled by steady hands. And among those hands is my father, Joseph Félicien Chevrolet, a master watchmaker, quiet, serious, always smelling faintly of oil and metal shavings. I am the second of 7 children, born not into comfort, but into a home filled with work, hunger, and the soft ticking of hope. My mother, Marie-Anne, was strong, not loud, just solid. If you've ever known a woman who could sew, clean, scold, and pray all at once, you've known someone like her. By 1887, I'm just 9 years old, but the world is already pulling me forward. My father decides we're leaving, not for riches, for work. We move to Beaune, a wine town in the heart of Burgundy, France. The vineyards roll like sleepy green waves, and the air smells different here. He finds work. I find something else: movement. You see, this is where I fall in love. Not with a girl, not yet, but with wheels. In Beaune, bicycles are everywhere. To a boy like me, they're more than transport. They're freedom machines. Lightweight, fast, elegant. I tinker with them endlessly. Not content just to ride. I want to improve them. I want to make them fly. One day, I salvage a broken one-cylinder engine. Most boys would stare. I strap it onto a tricycle and invent a strange little contraption, a pump that could help siphon wine from barrel to bottle. It worked. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine. People in town start talking about that odd little boy with grease under his nails and wild ideas in his head. If you were me, just a boy with no money, no schooling, no connections, but an obsession with engines, what would you do next? Would you settle? Or would you try to leap over every wall life put in front of you? By the time I'm a teenager, I'm working full-time in a mechanical shop, Roblin's, in Beaune. 10 years there. Filing metal, shaping parts, learning with my hands. No school, no classroom. Just noise, heat, and discipline. It's not glamorous. But every bolt I tighten teaches me something. Every faulty valve becomes a puzzle to solve. I am building not just machines, I am building a life. France at the time is changing. The streets are filling with strange new machines, steam cars, motor tricycles, combustion engines. It's 1899. I'm barely 20, and I know one thing. France isn't big enough for the life I want to build. So I leave. Not with fanfare. Not with a plan. Just the dream of America glowing in my chest like a furnace. I arrive first in Montreal. It's cold, hard, unfamiliar. But work is work. I do what I've always done. Find machines, fix them, improve them. Speak little, listen much. Then I make the biggest leap yet. In 1901, I step off a train in New York City. And for the first time in my life, I see a place louder than my thoughts, taller than my dreams. Skyscrapers rise like gods. Cars, carriages, trolleys rattle through the streets. I smell fuel, money, ambition, and I think, yes, this is where I belong. I find work quickly at a small mechanical company run by a fellow Swiss immigrant. Then, soon after, I make my way to a Brooklyn outpost of the French automaker de Dion-Bouton. They've got engineers. I've got curiosity. Before long, I'm working on engines, real engines, not tricycle pumps or busted bicycles, engines that could power something grander. Do you ever wonder, what's the moment your life quietly changes forever? Not with a bang, not with applause, just a click, a turn of fate's wheel. That was mine. But I wasn't done moving yet. Not even close. The Atlantic was behind me now, and so was the quiet life of a clockmaker's son. I was 23, living in New York, and for the first time, I could feel my future pressing against the edges of my chest like a piston ready to fire. In those early days, everything was fast, too fast almost. The streets of New York thundered with hoofbeats and wheels, and I swear the sky looked taller here. The buildings didn't end. They just vanished into clouds. But it wasn't the chaos that caught me. It was the engines. At the time, automobiles were still toys for the wealthy or tools for the bold. Most people scoffed at them. Noisy death traps, they said. Nothing will ever replace the horse. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. This wasn't just a novelty. It was a revolution. I started working with a man named de Dietrich, assembling French-imported cars in the US. But the real turning point came when I joined a small company on the edge of Manhattan. Fiat. Yes, that Fiat. Back then, they were new in America, looking for young, brave souls to build and test their machines. Now let me ask you something. If you were in my boots, barely speaking English, working day and night with barely enough to eat, and someone asked, "Would you like to drive one of these cars, fast?" What would you say? I said yes, not just because I was hungry, but because speed was the only thing that ever made sense to me. It wasn't about going fast for fun. It was about understanding the machine, feeling how it breathed, when it strained, when it soared. And believe me, those early cars didn't purr. They roared, spat, and bucked like angry bulls. I drove my first real race in 1905. It was the Gordon Bennett Cup trials. I was just a mechanic, really. No formal training. but I knew the engine better than the driver. So when the moment came and they handed me the wheel, I didn't hesitate. The track was brutal. Dirt, stones, clouds of dust. I remember gripping that wooden wheel until my knuckles turned white. No windshield, no seat belts, no rules really. Just man versus machine. And I loved it. People noticed. The newspapers called me the daring Swiss, and suddenly doors began to open. That year, I met the man who would change my life, William C. Durant. Now, Durant wasn't a racer. He was a businessman, but he had vision. He saw that automobiles weren't just machines, they were the future. He was building something big, General Motors. He watched me race, and then he asked, "How would you like to drive for Buick?" Let me tell you, at that time, Buick wasn't the smooth, polished brand you might think of today. Back then, it was raw potential, and I was the fire they needed to light it up. I started racing for Buick in 1906, and I didn't just win, I dominated. Every race was a lesson. Every wreck, a scar. I'd blow tires, snap axles, break bones, but I kept coming back. Not for the trophies, not even for the money, but because I could feel the future in my hands every time I tightened the bolts on a new car. One of the strangest things about racing back then, you didn't just drive the car. You built it, tuned it, loved it, cursed it. And if something broke on the track, you fixed it mid-race, sometimes with your bare hands. Have you ever had something you cared for that deeply? Something you'd sacrifice everything for? If you had to risk your life, your fingers, your future, to chase your dream, would you? By 1909, I wasn't just known. I was famous. The newspapers followed me. Mechanics whispered my name. And Durant? He kept watching. But not just for my driving. He saw something else. He knew I wasn't just a racer. I was a builder. I had ideas. I sketched engines late into the night. I talked about valve timing the way poets talk about sonnets. I didn't want to just drive the best car. I wanted to create it. So one night, over dinner, Durant leaned in and said, "Louis, how would you like to build your own car with your name on the front?" I paused. My name on the front. It wasn't vanity. It was destiny. I wanted to create something that would outlive me. Something faster, stronger, more beautiful than anything on the road. Would you say yes? I did, with both hands. But dreams, as I would learn soon, come with a cost. They say putting your name on something changes how you treat it. Suddenly, it's not just metal and bolts. It's your soul out there in the world, roaring at 70 miles per hour. By 1911, I was no longer just a racer. I was a co-founder. Together with William Durant, we established the Chevrolet Motor Company. Yes, the very name that still shines on cars today. Back then, it was just a dream sketched out in grease and fire, but it carried my name, and with that came a weight I'd never known before. We set up shop in Detroit. Cold winters, tough people, and streets that seemed to hum with ambition. Our goal was simple: build a car that Americans could be proud of, powerful, reliable, and fast. Not just another copy of the Ford Model T. No, something with elegance, with heart. I poured everything I had into the first Chevrolet. I worked side by side with the engineers, tweaking every valve, shaping the body lines, making sure it wasn't just a car, it was mine. And when the first model, the Classic 6, rolled out of the factory in 1912, I remember running my hand across the polished hood and whispering, "This is only the beginning." But beginnings are complicated. You see, Durant and I, we were very different men. I was a mechanic, a racer. I believed in precision and performance. I wanted to build the best car, no matter the cost. Durant, he was a salesman, a visionary, yes, but also a businessman to his bones. He wanted volume. He wanted numbers. He wanted a car that could compete head-to-head with the cheap, practical Model T. And I refused to build cheap. We argued. Oh, how we argued. Sometimes late into the night, right there on the factory floor. I'd say, "This car carries my name. It needs to be great." He'd shoot back, "It needs to sell, Louis." Tell me, if your name were on the line, if it were you whose reputation would be judged by every rattle and squeak, would you compromise? I couldn't. And that stubbornness, my pride, led to the hardest decision I ever made. In 1914, just 3 years after founding the company, I walked away. Yes, I left Chevrolet, my own name, signed away my shares for a payout so modest, it wouldn't even buy you a single Corvette today. Imagine that. Your name becoming a global symbol, and you, a footnote. I won't lie, it hurt. Watching the Chevrolet brand explode in popularity while I stood on the sidelines was like watching someone else raise your child. But I don't regret it, because I stood by my principles, and I never stopped creating. After leaving the company, I joined my brothers, Arthur and Gaston, and together we started a new adventure, the Frontenac Motor Corporation. A small shop, yes, but a passionate one. We weren't trying to build cars for the masses. We were building racing machines, sleek, powerful, purpose-built for the roar of the track and the thrill of victory. And that's where I found peace again, at the track, in the workshop, covered in oil and ideas. In 1915, I even went back to racing. Couldn't help myself. I drove in the Indianapolis 500 twice, not just as a driver, but in a car I helped design. There's a kind of poetry to that, don't you think? And speaking of poetry, let me tell you about my brother Gaston. You see, Gaston was born to race. Where I was the builder and thinker, he was pure instinct, smooth, fearless. In 1920, he raced in the Indy 500 and won. A Chevrolet crossing the finish line first. It was one of the proudest days of my life. But fate, as always, had its own plan. Later that year, during another race in Beverly Hills, Gaston was killed in a crash. I can still remember the silence that followed, the stillness, as if the whole world paused to grieve. He was only 28. After that, something changed in me. I kept building, kept tinkering, but my heart, it was no longer chasing speed. It was chasing memory, legacy. What about you? If you lost the person closest to you, would you keep going? Would you press forward? Or would you stop, stare at the road behind you, and wonder if it was all worth it? Sometimes, I still wonder. I didn't become rich. I didn't become powerful. But I did what I loved, and I built machines that changed lives. I worked with my hands, lived with my heart, and left something behind. And even though the world doesn't always remember me, they remember the name. Chevrolet. That's something, isn't it? The older I get, the more I understand how life is not a straight road. It's more like a winding racetrack. With every sharp turn, you think the next straightaway will bring rest. But there's always another curve. After Gaston died, the world didn't feel the same. The garage, the track, the sound of engines, they all felt quieter, even when they were loud. My little brother had been more than family. He was the fire in our shop. He gave life to the things we built. And when that flame went out, the shadows got longer. But I didn't stop. No, I couldn't. I still had Arthur, and I still had the dream we'd shared since we were boys in Switzerland, to build cars that pushed the edge of possibility. Together, we poured ourselves into Frontenac. You've probably never heard of that company. Most haven't. But in its time, it was a spark. We didn't just build cars. We built speed. We built champions. Back in those days, the Indy 500 was more than a race. It was a proving ground. The world watched. Drivers risked their lives, and the mechanics risked their reputations. We entered cars nearly every year through the 1920s, each one a product of sleepless nights, grease-stained notebooks, and relentless trial and error. One of my proudest moments came in 1921. Though Gaston was gone, his memory lived on in our work. That year, a Frontenac car, powered by our engine, built in our shop, took third place at the Indy 500. Think about that. A tiny operation, run by a few stubborn brothers going up against the giants of the industry, and we were right there on the podium. That's the kind of thing that keeps a man going, even through sorrow. Still, racing was changing. It was becoming faster, more dangerous, and more expensive. The big manufacturers were beginning to dominate. Frontenac didn't have the deep pockets or the shiny marketing. We had talent, we had passion, but sometimes that's not enough. So we pivoted. In the mid-1920s, I turned my attention to aviation. Yes, flying machines. It might sound strange, but in those days, the line between cars and planes was thinner than you'd think. Many early aviators came from the world of racing. It was the same hunger, speed, risk, innovation. And so, in 1927, I helped launch the Chevrolet Brothers Aircraft Company. It felt like starting over again. New blueprints, new engines, new dreams. We weren't just trying to build planes. We were trying to make them more accessible, easier to produce. Our aim was to democratize flight, just like Henry Ford had done for the automobile. If you had been me then, after all I had lost, after leaving my own company, after burying my brother, would you have had the strength to start again in a whole new field? Or would you have given in? Leave a comment below, tell me what you'd do. For a few years, the aircraft company showed promise. We built a sleek monoplane called the Chevrolet, lightweight and elegant. with a streamlined design that turned heads at airfields across the Midwest. People whispered that we were on the verge of something great. But whispers don't pay the bills. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression hit hard. People weren't buying cars, let alone airplanes. Factories went quiet. Hopes went still. We couldn't compete. The Chevrolet Brothers Aircraft Company folded. Another dream lost to the dust. And so I found myself back where I started, with nothing but my hands. I went to work for the Chevrolet Company, not as an executive or founder, but as a mechanic. Isn't that something? The company bore my name in chrome, and yet I was just another man in coveralls, tightening bolts, adjusting pistons. Some people called that a tragedy. I didn't. Because there's dignity in labor, and there's a kind of peace in simplicity, knowing the engines I once built with pride were still part of my world, even if the world had moved on. I would sometimes stand outside the factory in Detroit and watch the workers file in and out. Young men who didn't know who I was, and that was okay. I didn't need applause. I had lived. I had raced. I had built machines that soared and roared. I had shaped history, even if history forgot my face. And if you were me, would that be enough? Or would you chase more? If you ever find yourself feeling invisible in a world that seems to pass you by, I hope you'll remember this part of my story. That even in the background, even without the glory, you can still build something that lasts. Something that carries your fingerprints, your fire. My story wasn't over. Not yet. Even in the shadows, I kept creating. It's a strange thing to live long enough to become a ghost in your own story. By the 1930s, I was no longer the young daredevil who had raced at Indianapolis or stood at the helm of a mighty automobile empire. My hands had stiffened with age. My name, once shouted by reporters and carved onto trophies, was mostly forgotten, except on the grills of cars I no longer touched. But I didn't disappear. No, I just shifted, like the wind changing directions. After the collapse of our aircraft business, I returned to the only place I had ever truly belonged, the workshop. There was something deeply comforting about the rhythm of mechanical work. The clink of tools, the smell of oil and steel. In a world that had moved on, I could still find meaning there. Not in headlines, not in titles, but in honest labor. If you ever feel like the world no longer has space for your dreams, maybe it does, just in a different form. What if your dreams simply matured, like you did? I took small jobs. Sometimes I worked with little engineering shops. Other times I was back at Chevrolet in Detroit, not as a founder, but as a machinist or consultant. I never made much money, certainly nothing close to what my name was worth. But I had pride. And perhaps more importantly, I had peace. Let me tell you something most people don't know. Success is not always fame. Sometimes, success is sleeping at night knowing you've built something real, something you can touch, even if no one else remembers your name. And yet, every now and then someone would remember. One afternoon, I must have been in my late 50s by then, I was working at a small garage on the outskirts of Detroit. A young engineer came by to deliver a part. He looked at me, puzzled. Then suddenly his eyes lit up. "Aren't you Louis Chevrolet? I nodded. He stood there, stunned, almost reverent. He told me how he had grown up hearing stories about the early days of auto racing, about the fearless Swiss American who had once beaten giants and co-founded an empire. His father had talked about me as if I were a legend, a myth. And there I was, covered in grease, turning wrenches like anyone else. "Why are you here?" he asked. I smiled. "Because this is what I love, and because even legends have to eat." If you were me in that moment, would your pride be bruised? Or would you feel something warmer? Like being recognized, not for your face, but for the meaning behind your name. Sometimes, that's enough. In 1934, I was honored at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It had been nearly 2 decades since I had last raced there. But the racing community hadn't forgotten. They called me a pioneer, a visionary. They gave me a silver plaque and kind words. But what touched me most was something else. They let me walk the track. I stood on that sacred strip of asphalt, weathered, cracked, but still humming with memories. I could almost hear the roar of the crowd from years past, the engines screaming, the thrill of victory and the agony of loss. I looked up into the grandstands, remembering the last time Gaston had waved from his car, remembering the feel of the wheel in my hands. That moment, it was like visiting a childhood home you no longer own. I closed my eyes, felt the sun on my face, and smiled. Life is a race, but not every lap needs a checkered flag. Sometimes just getting back on the track is enough. And yet, I still tinkered, still sketched out ideas on napkins, still walked past car dealerships to glance at the new models, wondering what I would have done differently. Technology marched on, but my imagination stayed young. If you had been me, pushed aside by the world you helped build, would you have been bitter? Or would you have kept dreaming like I did? Leave a comment below and tell me what your heart would have done. As the 1930s faded into the 1940s, I began to slow down. My health wasn't what it used to be. My hands, once so sure and steady, trembled more now. But the fire in me never died. Not completely. One day, I was sitting in a diner just outside Detroit, sipping coffee and scribbling ideas for an engine cooling system. A boy walked past me wearing a Chevrolet baseball cap. He didn't know who I was. And that, my friend, was beautiful. Because in that moment, I realized my name had outlived me. My dream, the dream of building something fast, something powerful, something yours, had taken root in the hearts of millions. And it didn't matter whether they knew where it came from. What mattered was that it kept moving, just like me. The 1940s came with a quiet kind of loneliness. Most of the people I had raced with, built with, dreamed with, they were gone. Some passed away, others faded into the distance. A few found fame, most did not. And me? I was still here, still walking the streets of Detroit with aching knees, a grease-stained notebook in my coat pocket, and ideas I never stopped believing in. It's funny, isn't it? How a man can outlive his moment. I used to think that being remembered was the most important thing. But now, I think maybe remembering holding on to those you've lost, those moments of joy and pain. That's the real treasure. I had become, in a way, a living relic, a name that had become bigger than the man who bore it. People knew Chevrolet cars, of course. In post-war America, they were everywhere. Sleek, powerful, proudly American. Fathers drove them to work. Mothers packed up the kids for road trips. Teenagers took them to drive-in movies. But no one thought of me when they saw those chrome letters. And I learned to be okay with that. If you were me, watching the world rush forward, faster than ever, would you chase it? Or would you sit quietly, smiling at what you helped set in motion? Me, I chose to smile, but that didn't mean I gave up. In those years, I spent time helping a few young mechanics in the neighborhood. I'd stop by their shops, not for money, but for the smell of oil and the joy of conversation. They'd gather around, eager to hear my stories, racing at Indy, designing the Series C Classic 6, flying with the Chevrolet. I'd show them how to shape a fender by hand, how to tune an engine by ear. I wasn't building empires anymore. I was planting seeds. I even met a boy once, couldn't have been more than 16, who had read about me in a dusty old magazine. He said, "Mr. Chevrolet, why did you sell your company?" His eyes were wide, filled with disbelief. I looked at him and answered simply, "Because I thought I knew better." That answer hung in the air. Would you have done the same? Traded fortune for pride? Walked away from a name that would one day become part of American identity, just to hold on to your own stubborn vision? What would you have done? Comment below. I'm listening. There were moments in those years that hurt more than I let on. Watching the Chevrolet brand become a titan while I lived modestly, scraping by. Seeing my old rivals live in comfort while I worked small jobs to stay afloat. But there were also moments of quiet beauty, like walking past a row of gleaming Chevys and knowing, deep in my bones, that none of it would exist without me. Not the engines, not the badges, not the families inside those cars. I had lit the first match, and even though others had taken the torch and run with it, that fire was still mine. In 1936, I was hospitalized for a time. My body was beginning to falter. The doctors spoke softly, like people do when they're afraid to say too much. But I wasn't afraid. I'd lived more lives than most people dream of. Raced faster, failed harder, dreamed louder. During those long hospital nights, I'd lie awake listening to the hum of the machines and imagine engines revving instead. I'd close my eyes and see the tracks again, Indianapolis, Daytona, the dirt roads of France. I could still feel the steering wheel in my hands, the rumble of speed in my chest. Sometimes, I wondered what Gaston would say if he could see me now, or Etienne, or my mother, back in Le Chaux de Fonds. Would they be proud? Or would they shake their heads at the twists and turns I took? Maybe both. But here's the truth I've come to understand. Failure isn't the end of a dream. It's part of it. It shapes it, refines it. You can't truly know the value of success unless you've also tasted the bitter edge of regret. And if you've ever made a mistake so large it haunts you, know this: it doesn't erase your legacy. It deepens it, makes it real. I kept dreaming, even when my body wouldn't let me work like I used to. I'd sketch ideas, better carburetors, improved cooling systems, even wild concepts for electric motors, long before anyone took them seriously. None of it came to market, but that wasn't the point. The point was, I never stopped imagining. Can you say the same? Do you still dream, even when no one's watching? Even when the world tells you you're too old, too late, too forgotten? I hope you do. Because that's what kept me alive. Not money, not fame. The spark, the hum of an idea coming to life. The feeling of pushing the limit just one more time. The final years of my life felt like the slow winding down of a once roaring engine. Still warm, still humming, but quieter, softer. I spent more time alone during those days. Not out of bitterness, but reflection. When you've lived a life filled with noise, with motion, with the roar of engines and the cheering of crowds, silence becomes a strange comfort. Like sitting on the porch after a storm, listening to the drip, drip, drip of rainwater from the eaves. In 1937, my health declined more rapidly. I was in and out of the hospital. The aches in my bones weren't just from old age. They were the echoes of crashes, accidents, and late nights bent over an engine block. My body was reminding me of every risk I had taken, every mile I had raced. I stayed at the charity hospital in Detroit, not far from the heart of the city that once watched me build my dreams from nothing. The Chevrolet plant wasn't far, just a few miles down the road. On quiet nights when the wind blew just right, I could almost hear the hum of the assembly lines, the sound of progress, the sound of something I had started. And yet no one there knew I was just a few streets away. Isn't that something? Imagine creating a legacy so vast, it spans the entire nation, and yet dying in anonymity. Would that sit right with you? Could you find peace knowing the world kept spinning without looking back? I had to. And in some strange way, I did. Sometimes a young nurse would ask, "Are you the Louis Chevrolet?" And I'd smile. Depends which one you mean. Because I wasn't just one thing. I wasn't just the name on a car. I was the racer, the dreamer, the stubborn inventor, the brother who lost family to the very machine he loved, the man who gave up his company for pride, the one who kept sketching even when no one asked him to. Would you have done better? Wiser? Would you have held on to that company, watched it grow into a giant, even if it meant sacrificing your vision? Be honest. Leave me a comment. I'm curious. By 1938, I knew the end was near. I didn't fear death. I had danced with it too many times to be afraid. But I did feel a quiet sadness. Not for what I had done, but for what might have been. For the things I never got to finish. The ideas I never brought to life. I thought often of Gaston in those final months. His life was like a spark, blazing, beautiful, and gone in a flash. Mine was more like an ember, glowing for a long time, sometimes flickering, but always burning. I missed him. I missed our shared language, our rivalry, our laughter. Detroit had changed so much. When I first arrived in America, It was the land of steam whistles and wooden sidewalks. By the time I was old, it had become a city of steel and glass, of neon lights and roaring highways. The future had arrived, and I, in my quiet hospital room, was its forgotten architect. If you walk the streets of Detroit today, you might pass the site of the old Chevrolet factory. You might see a shiny new model glide past on electric wheels, with not a puff of exhaust. No one would think of the man lying quietly in 1941 West Grand Boulevard, drawing sketches by hand, dreaming of engines that didn't yet exist. But maybe now you will. Maybe you'll remember me. I didn't die a rich man, far from it. But I died knowing that I had changed something. That a boy from Switzerland could come to America and write his name in steel and speed. I died on June 6, 1941. The newspapers printed a few short lines. Louis Chevrolet, automotive pioneer, dies in Detroit. No fanfare, no national mourning. But that's okay. Legends aren't always honored in their time. Sometimes they're rediscovered. Sometimes, late at night, a stranger reads your story and says, "Wow, I didn't know." And that's enough, because it means the story isn't over. It means the ember still glows. So I ask you again, what would you have done in my place? Would you have chased the money or the dream? Would you have risked it all for one perfect machine? Leave a message for me if you want. Something you'd send back through time. A word of encouragement, or advice, or just to say thank you. I'll be listening. Death may have closed my eyes, but it could never silence my legacy. The years that followed my passing were, well, remarkable. For Chevrolet, for General Motors, for the world of cars, and for me, even in absence. I want to tell you something funny. In life, I was mostly ignored by the corporation that bore my name. But in death, suddenly I mattered again. It started slowly. A nod in a brochure, a line in a company history, a footnote. But then something shifted. As Chevrolet sales boomed through the post-war years, millions of cars rolling off the line each year, someone asked, who was Louis Chevrolet? And so the story resurfaced. My story. And isn't that strange? That it takes death for people to really look at you, to say your name with curiosity instead of dismissal. If you were me, would you feel bitter? Or grateful? Or maybe a bit of both? I was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in 1969, nearly 3 decades after I took my last breath. And yes, I wish I could have seen it. Wished I could have stood there, hand on heart, watching history finally remember. But life doesn't always give you that moment. Sometimes your applause comes after the curtain falls. In those years after the war, the Chevrolet brand exploded. By the 1950s, it wasn't just a car, it was an icon. Families across America drove Chevys. Teenagers cruised in hot rod Bel Airs. Soldiers returning from Europe bought Chevys with their GI Bill money. There was pride in owning one, trust, identity. That bow tie badge became a symbol of the American dream, of mobility, of possibility. And yet, that symbol had come from a man who could barely afford a bed in his final days. You might say, that's unfair. But life isn't about fairness. It's about the choices you make and the things you leave behind. And I left behind something powerful. Not just a car, but an idea. That anyone could make something that lasts. That a foreign-born mechanic with calloused hands and broken English could help build an empire that outlived him by 100 years and counting. Would you have held on to the company? Sold your shares later when they were worth millions? It's a fair question. But remember what I've told you. I wasn't chasing dollars. I was chasing speed. Perfection. The machine. That was always my love. My mistress. My obsession. Sometimes, I dreamt of the old days. The sound of wrenches, the oil-slick floors, the smell of gasoline. Of racing down dirt tracks in a cloud of dust and glory. And I wondered, do kids today know that once cars were magic? Not just transportation, but transformation. Chevrolet helped build American roads, American towns, American stories. There was a time when the car parked in your driveway was your identity. And more often than not, it had my name on the hood. Do you remember the Impala? The Corvette? The Camaro? All children of the company I helped conceive, none of them perfect, but all born from that same restless spirit, the spirit of a man who believed machines could fly. Today, the Chevrolet name is global. It's in countries I never even visited. It's sold in languages I never learned. But everywhere it goes, it carries a trace of me. My line drawings, my wild ambition, my sweat. Somewhere, a kid is opening a Matchbox car and seeing that name for the first time. Not knowing it belonged to a real man. Not knowing that man built his first car with his hands and his heart. Not a computer. And maybe, just maybe, one day they'll be curious enough to look me up, to learn about the races, the risks, the rivalries, to learn that I was never just a logo. I was a man, full of flaws, but full of fire. Would you have remembered me if I hadn't put my name on that car? Or would I have faded like so many forgotten engineers? Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was ego, but that name, Chevrolet, was my anchor, my fingerprint on history. And now, it's yours to carry. Tell it well. Even as time moved forward, my story kept following me, like the exhaust of a race car you just can't shake. You might think that when a man dies penniless in a Detroit apartment, history forgets him. But if that man's name is stamped on tens of millions of cars, well, he never really disappears. Sometimes I imagine what it would have felt like to walk into a Chevy dealership in the 1970s or 80s. Neon lights humming. Rows of sleek new models gleaming under showroom bulbs. And there, right on the front grille, my name, Chevrolet. Would the salesman have recognized me? Would they have said, "That's him, that's Louis"? Or would I just have been another face in the crowd? Some old man with oil on his hands and stories no one had time to hear. That's the thing about legacy. It doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes, it drips slowly, like oil from a tired engine. But eventually, it gets where it's going. Let me tell you something few people know. In 1940, the year before I died, General Motors finally sent me a small pension, just enough to keep food on the table, maybe a gesture of conscience, or maybe just a footnote on a spreadsheet. But I took it, proudly, because I never asked for charity, just respect. And in the decades after, I watched, quietly from beyond, as the world began to piece together who I really was. Not just a racer, not just an engineer, but a dreamer who put movement into metal. And while General Motors became one of the largest corporations in the world, I was gradually becoming part of American folklore. The immigrant mechanic turned legend. Have you ever walked past a statue and wondered who the person was? Have you ever paused long enough to ask, what did they dream about? What did they sacrifice? Because in 2006, the city of Indianapolis unveiled a bronze statue of me and my brothers in front of the Speedway Hall of Fame Museum. And there I was, immortalized in metal, the very thing I used to shape every day. I stood tall, cast in stillness, but full of motion and memory. Fans stopped to take pictures, children pointed, and someone, somewhere, finally said my name out loud. Louis Chevrolet. You know, I think that's all most of us want in the end. To not be forgotten, to not be mistaken for a footnote, to leave a mark, even if it's just a smudge on a piston or a name on a hood ornament. And yes, people finally began writing about me. Biographies, documentaries, my story told in classrooms and car shows and bedtime tales just like this one. A life of triumph, failure, speed, and stubbornness. And I hope you're still with me. Because this story, it's not just about cars. It's about what you leave behind when the engine stops. If you were me, would you have lived your life differently? Would you have chosen a quieter path? More money, less passion? Or would you have chased the horizon, even if it burned everything you had? There's no right answer, only your answer. I often think about Etienne and Arthur, my brothers. They shared this journey with me, especially Etienne. His hands were just as dirty as mine, his dreams just as wild. He stayed in the game longer, designing, engineering, always tinkering. We were different in many ways, but we were brothers, in blood, in spirit, and in gears. And now, when I see the Chevrolet name stretch across billboards in Brazil, or race across digital dashboards in electric vehicles, I feel a strange calm. Because that name, it still moves. And movement, my friend, is the heartbeat of everything I ever loved. If you could send me a message, just one line, whispered through time, what would you write? Leave it in the comments. I'll be listening, in the hum of an engine, in the turn of a wrench. The world is so different now. I look down from wherever I might be, and I see electric cars gliding silently down city streets. I see teenagers learning to drive with software that guides them, cars that park themselves, engines that barely make a sound. It's strange, beautiful in its own way. And yet, sometimes I wonder, would people today even recognize the roar of the machines I built with my own hands? But still, the name is there, Chevrolet, on trucks in Texas, on sleek SUVs in Tokyo, on family sedans and racing beasts alike. My name. Funny, isn't it? I never made a fortune off it. In fact, I walked away from it, sold my stake, let others build the empire. But in the end, it's what I'm remembered for. I can't pretend I don't take pride in that. Even now, in this quiet place. Let me take you back to one final scene, one that most history books never mention. It was 1941 and I was nearing the end. My health had declined and life in Detroit had grown smaller. I wasn't building engines anymore. My days of racing were long gone. My money was nearly gone too. But I still had one thing left: my story. A young mechanic once knocked on my apartment door, clutching a notebook and wide-eyed with admiration. "Are you really Louis Chevrolet?" he asked, as if I were a ghost. I laughed and invited him in. We talked for hours, about racing, about the early Chevrolets, about what it felt like to drive faster than anyone else on Earth. And before he left, I told him something I want to tell you now. It's not the fame or the fortune that matters. It's whether at the end of your life you can look back and say, "I chased what I loved. I gave it everything I had." He nodded, wrote it down, word for word. That was probably the last time anyone interviewed me. You know, the Chevrolet brand has gone through so many phases: muscle cars, family cars, hybrids, even electric now. It's evolved just like America has. But underneath the design tweaks and marketing slogans, there's still a beating heart, a spirit. One that believes in pushing limits, in dreaming big, in moving forward. That's the part I gave it. I never got rich. I died without a home to call my own. But what I left behind, well, that's not something you can measure in dollars. Legacy isn't about wealth, it's about impact. So if you're still awake, and I hope you're not, listen to me one last time. When you're standing at a crossroads, when the world tells you to play it safe, remember the mechanic from Le Chaux de Fonds, who built engines out of junk and dared to dream of speed. If you were me, would you have made different choices? Would you have walked away from your name to keep your freedom? Or held on, even if it meant compromise? There's no easy answer, just the road you choose. And the road always tells the story in the end. Now, let's slow things down a bit. Let the last vibrations of my voice drift into the night like a cooling engine. You've come with me through the snow-covered Swiss valleys, across the Atlantic to a wild and hungry America. You've raced with me on dirt tracks and soared with me across factory floors. You've watched me rise, fall, and leave something behind. And now we fade gently into the quiet part of the journey. The part where stories rest and dreams breathe. You may not see many Chevrolets with my face on them, but every time a young person steps into a garage, wipes their hands on a rag, and whispers, "Let's build something," that's me. Every time a car roars to life, full of purpose and possibility, that's me too. My descendants, well, they've gone on to live their lives in ways I could never have imagined. I don't know that they've built engines or raced cars, but I hope they've carried the fire in some way, the daring, the grit, because what we leave behind isn't just a name, it's a spirit. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. I hope it stays with you. And if you ever hear an engine hum just right, remember me. Good night, my friend. Sweet dreams.